You are now listening to the North Shore Drive Podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter. Hello and welcome everyone to the return of the North Shore Drive Podcast here from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm going to be the host for this show whenever we're doing it. I'm going to be bringing up, my name is Chris Carter. I'm here in the Post-Gazette. Here, my friend and fellow Pitt writer, Noah Hiles.
My goodness.
Here. We're out here. We made it. Noah, you and I, we have been around the Pittsburgh scene for quite some time. We've worked together before. I'm excited to do this with you. This new version of the North Shore Drive podcast, this is just the beginnings of it. We're working on building a studio. We're working on, intro music, interlude music. We're going to have a lot of other things branding-wise that's going to keep building out. But we wanted to get something out there for all of our followers, all of our subscribers, all of our viewers and listeners to see that we are back here and we are talking about one of the biggest things that I think we've seen for Pitt sports in a long time, and that's the return of the Backyard Brawl. Noah, we're going to get to more about the Backyard Brawl in a sec, but I think what adds to this Backyard Brawl, it's not just the fact that the rivalry's back, is that there's legitimate excitement that this could be a huge year for Pitt with the schedule ahead of them.
Yeah, well, first off, glad to be here back with you, Chris. Always fun to create content with you. And like you said, with the excitement, I remember when I accepted this position, one of the many things that got me going was this is the most buzz that's been around the Pitt football program, I think, in my lifetime. I mean, you can recall when they had exciting games, when they had exciting matchups, or even when they played in, notable bowl games. But going into a season, them to be coming off a conference championship, to be ranked in the teens, and to have two really good games to start the season, and with the first one being, of course, against West Virginia, a renewed rivalry that's gone on for over 100 years. The program really is at an all-time high since the 80s, I think, and that's super exciting for you and me to be a part of, for the fans and alumni who have been following this team throughout all of its highs and lows, and of course for the players who are associated with the Panthers and the coaching staff who worked to build it up to what it is. Now, that doesn't mean it's all going to work out for people who have been following Pitt throughout the years. Normally excitement can lead to some less exciting things to follow pretty quickly normally as well. And they're going to look to avoid that. We'll be here to cover it all. But like I said, it is a really exciting time. It's a really fun time to be around this Pitt athletic program, not just football, just like look at soccer, ranked number 2 in the country, blowing out West Virginia a couple days ago. Volleyball, obviously really good. It's a very interesting time going on in Oakland right now.
It's an awesome time because they get to celebrate the recent success.
Yeah.
This will be the first game since they've won at Acrisure Stadiums, formerly known as Heinz Field, since they've won the ACC championship. Like, Pitt fans have not been able to just celebrate the fact that they won that last year with their guys on the field yet. So I think that there's that element to it, but it's also like that wasn't just it. Like this is a year where they're ready to prove for Pat Narduzzi's program that wasn't a fluke, that this is something that they are going to be more regular contenders, not just in the ACC, but in the country. So I wanted to start off going over what we saw for Pitt's season ahead, because it's important not just for posterity's sake or for the fans, but also for things like recruiting. Like guys like Hakeem Williams, the one of the top receivers in this recruiting class coming up, he has Pitt on his watch list, but he says his announcement will come September 23rd. September 23rd is the day before Pitt takes on Rhode Island in their 4th game. Pitt will play West Virginia, Tennessee, and Western Michigan in those games. If Pitt can go into that time period undefeated and looking very strong as a program, I'm not saying that they would get a guy like Hakeem, but it will put them, I think, in the conversation of, it'll make it like, what if I did go to play for that program? Because they were the stuff last year, and I was a little worried this year that they were going to fall off, but they didn't. To me, especially these first 2 games, this is a time where Pitt has to strike while the iron is hot.
Yeah, and you talk about striking while the iron's hot. Like, you look at this schedule, and to talk more about the West Virginia matchup here, which we're going to do a lot later on in the show, but just looking at the schedule of why these games early on are exciting, the one thing missing, I think, from last season, while there were so many highs, you had award winners, you had records broken, you had a conference championship and a New Year's Six bowl game. The one thing that was missing was that rivalry win. You haven't had that since they beat Penn State all those years back.
Yep.
And then, before that, it was like 2008, I think, was the last time they beat West Virginia in the Backyard Brawl. That was the one thing missing. And you had the moments where, Pitt did take over the ACC championship. That the Panther Nation really showed up for that game. And
I was there for that one. It was crazy.
Pitt took over the North Shore for the Clemson game, and that's like the game where you look back for the crazy crowd or whatever. But when you think about over the last 20 years, the big Pitt wins and the craziest of the crowds, it's when they're playing the Notre Dames, the West Virginias, the Penn States, and they get that opportunity this year in week 1. And I think that more than anything, aside from the hype, with College Game Day being here and the history with the Backyard Brawl, it's just the idea that they haven't had the opportunity to play a real rival yet. And it's not a rivalry for the players. It's just not, because a lot of these guys, none of them have played against West Virginia. Most of them were in elementary school or in middle school the last time these two teams played. They're learning why it's a rivalry, and it will be a rivalry probably Friday, regardless of how the game plays out. But for now, this is something for the fans to be excited about. It's the number one thing that's been talked about all week on any sports media platform in this city and in Morgantown, West Virginia. It's a huge deal, and I think that's what makes this game extra special, is because it was the one thing last year lacked, was a matchup against a true rival, and they have that starting off in 2022.
Does this make this the most exciting game of the season, even though it's the first game of the season? And like, if they win this, there's still so many more questions. But is this the game that everyone's is like, this is it right here?
Yeah, because I just look at it and I think of every scenario. I think the only way you can make an argument is if going into the final week of the regular season, Pitt and Miami are close to undefeated, both top 10 schools.
Right.
But even then, I think if you were to ask any Pitt fan, if you were to pull 100 of them, like in Family Feud, and you would say, would you rather Pitt lose a top 10 battle against Miami in the final week of the regular season, or start the season off with a loss against West Virginia? They'll take the loss against the top 10 program late in the season, because that means that Pitt is still having a good year. They're still going to go to a good bowl game, and it's still a successful season, probably for many people's standards. A loss on Thursday to West Virginia will be catastrophic, because you got to lick your wounds quick, have your nice little barbecue on Labor Day weekend, and you got an SEC program coming to the North Shore for the first time in program history. They've never hosted an SEC opponent, and Tennessee's a really good football team. I think that's why it's the most intriguing matchup. It's just because there's so much more on how this season is really going to be determined on Thursday. And that sounds crazy to say, but a loss here can throw everything off the tracks real quick. A dominant win can really set the tone to show that last fall wasn't just the Kenny Pickett magical experience, that this is a legitimate program.
Absolutely. I'm actually going to say the game I think that people should be most excited about, because yes, West Virginia, the history, the home opener, all that awesome. If they beat Tennessee in a strong way. Last year, they eked by Tennessee. And that was a game where Hendon Hooker, their now starting quarterback, was not the starter to start the game. They pulled the starter, and Hendon Hooker went in. Hendon Hooker has a history of beating up on Pitt with his time at Virginia Tech. Then he went to Tennessee, wasn't the starter, but that game he proved to be the starter, and now he will be the starter this year. If they can go in, exercise their demons against Hendon Hooker, beat the Volunteers, go into the next week 2-0, that to me, and they're on the road at Western Michigan, that to me will be the big sign for everyone. Like, oh, wait, they handled the SEC team that came to town. Tennessee didn't just roll up in there and pull them out. That's where I think, because I think West Virginia is a good matchup for Pitt, and we'll get to more on that in just a second. But Tennessee is a team that I could see legitimately beating Pitt with their quarterback play. If they're able to take those guys on, I think you're right. There's one foundation that gets set, and then that'll set another foundation for the rest of the season. I also want to ask you, Noah, if there's one game on your list that you say is the biggest challenge, what is it?
It's actually Tennessee. That's how I look at it. I mean, you can look further down the line. I'm sure there's a different game in mind for you, one that's played possibly in the final week of the regular season against a team that beat them last year. However, I just think that with all of the attention and hype surrounding Thursday night, if they do win, and especially if they lose. I mean, they have to beat Tennessee. And, and if they beat West Virginia, they probably need to beat Tennessee to stay alive in the playoff picture or whatever. But it's not a death blow like the West Virginia loss would be, in my opinion. I think they could still lose to Tennessee and still be okay because it's a non-conference game. And I do think Tennessee is going to end the year ranked in the top 20. I think it's a really good team. I think Tennessee matches up against Pitt really well, just with their size and speed. They kind of have a lot what West Virginia doesn't have. And it's just a tough week 2 opponent after the high emotion. It's not like you're playing an FCS school. If they were playing Rhode Island week 2, I wouldn't be as concerned if I was Pat Narduzzi. But, you're going to have all that emotion, all that excitement coming off of that Thursday. And granted, they're going to have a lot of time to prepare, a couple extra days. Tennessee will as well. But that's, I think, probably the most talented team they're going to see until Miami. And I would argue that they're probably just as talented as Miami. I think they're just very underrated. One of the most underrated teams in the country, in my opinion. And it's gonna be tough. It's gonna be tough. Like you said, Hooker's really good. Partially, I just love Tennessee's uniforms. I love Rocky Top. Those are just, it's cool. It's cool when you see them, when you see Pitt play somebody they don't normally play. But that brings challenges to a program. And with the way the portal works, there's a lot of new guys on Pitt. There's a lot of new faces on Tennessee. So you can't really just bank on Kenny Pickett balling out in the second quarter like he did last year to kind of lead them to that victory. You're going to need a lot more than that. And I think it will be a challenge for them.
My biggest challenge is Miami coming down the wire. I think that if this is setting itself up, if both teams don't have major injuries and they don't stumble out the gates, I could see this being the determining of who goes to the ACC championship game, who's gonna be the biggest name going out there, and who's setting themselves up for a shot at the college football playoffs. Tyler Van Dyke is a bad man. Yeah. He showed it last year. I think he threw three or more touchdowns in every single start that he had last season, including the one against Pitt where he led Miami over Pitt in that win. But if Pitt throughout the season gets tested, against JT Daniels, their secondary, I think will get tested a little bit. If they're able to show week in and week out, they're not the same Pitt secondary that used to get torched regularly in games. That will be a great final test for them because I think Tyler Van Dyke will stretch the field. He'll challenge them a lot of ways. And that will be I think their biggest challenge. They get over that hump and they're heading to the ACC championship game. I would actually favor them over Clemson in that situation because I really think that they match up well with Clemson.
And I guess the only thing that put Tennessee as a bigger challenge, in my opinion, over Miami is by then it's week 12 or 13 or whatever it is with the buys. You know what type of football team you have by then. You know what Slovis can and can't do. You know what the offensive line's weaknesses are, and you know what guys are going to get the ball on what down in the receiving core, and you know what your defense's strengths and weaknesses are, and that's easier to form a solid game plan. Where when you're playing a really good team in week 2, it's harder. Like Narduzzi said, this is their first test. He said that on Monday about West Virginia. They have a really strong second test coming in. And I just think that's the difference. If they're playing Tennessee in week 12 and Miami in week 2, I switch my pick around as well. But I just think that coming off of WVU, playing a really talented team, and not knowing really what you have yet with some of these guys, it's just going to be tough to formulate a good game plan.
Last thing here before we move on to specifically just the West Virginia game. There's always a trap game that Pitt fans are looking for because they've had so many of them over the
trapped
years.
Every year.
They get trapped almost every year. Last year, it was Western Michigan. Is it Western Michigan again this year, or is there another team that Pitt needs to watch out for?
Listen, one thing you need to know about me is if there's a Whippeal guy, I'm going to give him a shout out. So shout out Jack Slopek, Norwin guy. But no, it's not Western Michigan. There's no sneaking up on Pitt if you're Western Michigan this year because they played a huge role on them possibly missing out on a playoff. I mean, the Miami loss probably kept them out regardless, but that Western Michigan loss really, really hurt their season.
Yep.
They're going to be pissed. And either way, I mean, if let's just say worst case scenario, they're 0-2 heading into that game. Well, then they have to win, right? If they're 1-1, they're either riding high off of a Tennessee win or they're pissed after a Tennessee win. So they're going to be coming after Western Michigan, and they just want payback in general. Western Michigan's a worse team than they were last year. They lost a really good quarterback, although, like I said, they're gaining a Whippeal boy under center. You love to see that. And they lost another Whippeal guy, Sky Moore. So I don't think it's Western Michigan. I think hands down the biggest trap game to worry about on this schedule is Virginia. You remember that game last year? That was a video game if I've ever seen one. Just, who could throw for more yards. Brennan Armstrong is a stud. I think there are better quarterbacks than him in the ACC. I do. But he's probably one of the best at throwing deep balls, which I think right now, from what we know about this Pitt team, is probably their biggest weakness on defense is defending the home run plays, just because of the way their scheme works, with how aggressive they are with rushing the passer. They're in a lot of cover 1, they're in a lot of cover 0, and that leaves you vulnerable for big plays over the top. And Armstrong is really good at throwing those deep balls. He did it well against them last year. He's only going to be better this year. If he's healthy, and just that's an interesting part in the season too. It's on the road. I could just see that being the trap game on Pitt's schedule this fall.
Certainly could be. I'm looking at North Carolina because my only thing with Virginia is certainly going to be a challenge. But my only thing with them is that it's tough for me to call them a trap game when they took Pitt to the mat last year when they had Kenny Pickett and Jordan Addison. And they took 4 touchdown receptions for Jordan Addison for them to beat them. North Carolina is a team I think a lot of people are overlooking. But
I mean, you're talking about North Carolina took Pitt to overtime last year.
Right, but they also had Sam Howell and a lot more going for them last year. I think with Drake May in there at quarterback, they're waiting. There's a lot of people saying, this will be a fall-off year. But they still got Josh Downs, who was one of the better ACC wide receivers last year. They've got Storm Duck. They've got Tony Grimes in that secondary. I don't think they're going to be as easy of a team. They're also a team that's going to use a lot of RPO. That confused Pitt a lot. They'll attack the middle parts of the field. Like Brennan Armstrong, they will test this secondary a bit. I think that could end up being a trap game. I still favor Pitt in that matchup right now. We'll see how these teams are when they meet later in the year. But it's funny that both you and I picked 2 of the road games that they have going on in the middle part of the season. Last thing here, actually that was the last thing. We're gonna take a quick break. When we come back, we're gonna get into the Backyard Brawl, specifically talking about what you can expect, everything to talk about for Pitt versus West Virginia. Stay right here with us on the North Shore Drive podcast. Here on the North Shore Drive podcast, I'm Chris Carter. He's Noah Hiles. We're both the Pitt writers for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Now, let's get into this specific matchup right now, because that's what everyone's looking about. Can Pitt actually come through and deliver a strong win at home? Noah, you wrote a whole thing about how College Game Day's back and everyone's excited about that. But beyond the fanfare of it, there are interesting matchups, interesting parts to this game where, like you said, Pitt secondary, they give up the home run ball. JT Daniels has a strong arm. He's a guy who can test that. I think that's a major part of how this game could play out, is how they handle his ability to stretch the field.
Well, then let's start with you then, Carter. Let's start with you. I want to hear your game prediction. I mean, you could read both of them on the Post-Gazette's website or in the Thursday paper. We'll have them published. But with those X's and O's being presented, you're the analytical guy. You're the one who loves breaking down the film. I actually want to hear your game prediction first. You're always teeing me up for success. I'd love to do that for you. Start us off here.
Pitt 34, West Virginia 17.
Okay.
I actually think that Pitt's going to control this game in a lot of ways. I think this could end up starting a little closer, not like a tie game, but going into half, Pitt could be up by 7 or 10ish, and West Virginia kind of be hanging in there. But this is a game where Pitt's going to come out. They're going to be able to score some points. I think West Virginia might hit on a home run player too, and that'll get into it. But when you start getting to those 3rd and long situations, and JT Daniels has to hold on to the ball a little bit longer, and he has to look down the field, you're going to have Kalijah Cansey. You're going to have Hobble Baldonado. You're going to have Desmond Alexander, John Morgan, all those type of guys just coming after JT Daniels. And this is an experienced offensive line that West Virginia has. I don't think that they're ready for Pitt's pass rush, and I think that is what kind of gets it going. JT Daniels, when I've watched past tape of his biggest mistakes come when he thinks pressure is coming and he forces a throw into coverage. Pitt's got athletic guys in the secondary. They'll get some turnovers. That'll allow it to build some scores, and I see them doubling up West Virginia at the end of the game. That's how I see Pitt winning it. What about you, Noah?
34-17. The people who have the over at 52 are not going to like that final score. And they're not going to like my final score either. I have Pitt 23, West Virginia 14. So I do like the Panthers in this one, and as you'll see in my prediction in the paper, I think this is, and if you're watching on YouTube, you see I have 79 as my background here on the screen here on StreamYard. And 79, you look, there's the road work. It's going to be a gritty game. 3 yards, cloud of dust, throw the record books out the window, all those cliches. Hey, Chris, these two teams,
I hate
they don't
you.
like each other.
I don't like you. I hate when you do this. Anyone that knows us knows you always say this stuff, and it drives me up a wall.
But it's going to be that type of game. It's going to be a very physical football game. I mean, I think the main person to keep an eye on, or who's going to have the biggest impact in this game, is Pitt's offensive coordinator. Cignetti, if you know anything about his teams, loves to run the football, and Pitt's going to run the football, and they're going to run the football well. I think Pitt has a huge advantage, both in the trenches on offense and defense, and we're going to see that from start to finish. I think they're going to control the time of possession a lot. I think Slovis will look sharp, but they're not going to need him to look good. They might take a couple of shots downfield, but I think it's going to be a lot of just grind it out, 10, 15 play drives from Pitt that sometimes won't even lead to points, but they're just going to keep West Virginia and JT Daniels off the field. It's going to force them to be overly aggressive, and he's going to have to stand in the pocket too long, which is going to lead to a lot of sacks, possibly lead to a lot of turnovers as well. And I just think Pitt's going to take a 2-score lead in the locker room at halftime. West Virginia might score a touchdown or two in garbage time to make this one look a lot closer than what it's actually going to be. I think Israel Abanikanda. I didn't know if I wanted to go with my Abanikanda Pittsburgh accent or not on that last name. But I think he's going to lead the charge. But I expect 3 or 4 Pitt running backs to have significant impact on this one, be it catching the ball out of the backfield or getting, 10 to 15 touches in some way, shape, or form. So I look at this to be a very smooth, easy, gritty win for the Panthers to start off the year.
And I think a big part of that is also, like you said, Israel Abanikanda, or if you just want to make it simple, call him Izzy, because that's what everyone calls him around the locker room. Izzy to the hizzy is what a lot of people like to say. That kid is explosive. He is fast. He is strong. He's quick. And that's what's going to be a big thing here. It's also very interesting, and I wrote about this after Pat Narduzzi's, announcing of the depth chart. This was the first time I've covered Pitt that they haven't had an or next to the starting running back's name. It was clearly Izzy Abanikanda's starting role at the running back position. That doesn't mean we won't see Rodney Hammond. Rodney Hammond. Doesn't mean we won't see Vince Davis or Sebo, but that tells me Abanikanda is going to be a big factor for this run game. And if he takes over this game, he's a guy, if you give him a seam, he will take a lot of yards off. That is a key factor. Pitt can get him going, and I think this would be a great trenches battle, but that's going to be a big part of it. We're going to talk more about the trenches battle and some of those key matchups in a minute here on the North Shore Drive podcast. Stay tuned. We got one more thing to break it down, giving you our players to watch. Chris Carter, Noah Hiles here on the North Shore Drive podcast. Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. It's your Pitt writers, Chris Carter and Noah Hiles, breaking things down for you. Last thing we're going to give you heard our predictions, but we're going to give you some players to watch in this game. And these we're not coming up with rabbit out of a hat and random guys that you don't know. We're going to give you which of the star players, which of the good players on Pitt that you should actually expect to have a big game from. Noah, who is the Pitt player that you're watching for the most to have a big game?
Well, the two main things that I pointed out in my game prediction were dominance in the trenches and Cignetti. I'm not going to sit here and pick like Carter Warren. That would be kind of weird. I don't know how you could.
What's wrong with Carter Warren?
Nothing's wrong with Carter Warren, captain of the team. Good for him. But I'm not going to analyze, left tackle play here on the podcast. I don't think anyone wants that. But a guy who I think will impact both through blocking and through Cignetti's, schemes is Gavin Bartholomew, the new starting tight end, a guy who really, had a really strong second half of the season last year, earned some ACC recognition on the freshman team, replaces Kroll at the starting tight end spot. And just, if you look at the way, Cignetti's style of offense gets involved, they get the tight ends involved. There's going to be a lot of under routes, I think, hit in this one. I expect him to have 7-8 receptions, probably not for a ton of yards, but he's going to make big plays in the red zone. And more importantly, I talked about how Izzy and the company in the backfield are going to have big games. And that's going to have something to do with Bartholomew as well. Getting those blocks on the linebackers that turn something into a 4-yard run, to a 12-yard run, things like that. I think he has the potential to have a huge game based off of how they match up, based off of how his new offensive coordinator likes to call plays and the style of offense that they're going to run. I expect him to have a big game Thursday night, and I expect him to have a really big season. I think he's going to be a really good player for Pitt this year.
I think he could be too. I really liked him last year. Lucas Krull is a heck of an athlete. Needs to learn how to park better because he takes up 2 parking spots every year. I forgot about you, Lucas. I remember your truck. But in all seriousness, Gavin Bartholomew was he was a standout player last year, so that's a great pick by you.
He's a big guy. 6'5", 255. That's a big dude.
He's gotten jacked. Last year, he looked like just a tall freshman who could play.
He looked
tight
like
end.
a freshman. He looks like a man now.
He looked like a grown man now.
Yeah.
But I will say my pick is not as deeper down to my pick is right off the top of the pile. It's the best player I think on Pitt's roster, and that's Kalijah Cansey.
Yeah,
he's a mean, quick, fast defensive tackle who's going to give a lot of people problems all year long. And the reason I say he's my player to watch, because I'm not going to just pick the quarterback every week or something like that. But I think for this matchup, for this team, West Virginia's biggest strength, I think, that they carry into this game is their offensive line. They return a lot of their starters this year. Doug Nestor at guard and Zach Frazier at center. Those two as a combination in the middle are going to be a good 1-2 punch for West Virginia this season. But if Kalijah Cansey can disrupt them and make sure, one, the run game can't get going and gets after JT Daniels, it's going to ruin everything that West Virginia wants to do with this game. It's going to take away their strengths. It's going to rattle JT Daniels, and it's going to test, hey, have you grown from when we saw you at Georgia, at USC, when you used to freak out when the pressure started to get to you? Will you start to throw those errant passes? And if Kalijah Cansey does that, Kalijah Cansey almost averaged a full tackle for loss for every game that he played. He averaged half a sack last year for every game he played. That got him second team All-America status for the Associated Press going into this season. I think this is a big game where if he blows up these guys who a lot of people are looking at on West Virginia's offensive line and saying, hey, they could wind up somewhere in the NFL very soon. If he blows those guys up and has a huge day in this one, I think Pitt walks away with an even bigger win than either of us are predicting. But 2, I think it further puts Kalijah Cansey up on a pedestal, and you start seeing people talk about, hey, maybe first-round grade here. We don't know. I think it's a really big chance for him. I think Kalijah Cansey is a heck of an athlete. He's gotten better each year. He says that defensive line coach Charlie Partridge has helped him get a faster first step. I didn't think it was possible with how Kalijah Cansey fires off the ball. If he gets things going, Pitt fans, you're going to have a very fun Thursday night. But either way, you better have a fun Thursday night. Don't be too crazy in the North Shore.
I was going to say, have a responsibly fun. Uber and Lyft exist for a reason. Use them, please.
Exactly. Don't drive drunk and clean up after yourselves. I don't want to be seeing trash all over the North Shore on the North Shore Drive. But hey, we just got through the first episode of the return of the North Shore Drive podcast.
Chris, I got to tell you, it's I could never imagine doing a podcast with you. So this is, new. This is monumental for us.
We've never done one before, have we?
Not at all.
Never in the history of existence.
Exactly.
Apparently. But Noah, this was a blast, man. Yeah. I'm excited. The both of us are going to be there at Acrisure Stadium early. We hope everyone enjoys their time out. If you're in Pittsburgh and you're not going to this game, first of all, I don't know what's wrong with you. Second of all, you better avoid the North Shore because it's going to be packed out there. And don't listen to Vivid Seats, who said it's going to be 75% West Virginia fans. That's just ridiculous. That's not going to happen. But absolutely, thanks again for checking out the North Shore Drive podcast. We're going to be up on all the platforms: Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts. We're also on YouTube. If you enjoyed this on YouTube, like the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette's channel. This is just the beginning. We're getting things started. We're working on building a studio. This show is going to grow so much more. Thanks again, Noah, for being on the show. We're going to break down Steelers, Pirates, Penguins, Pitt, Penn State. We're going to have a lot of breakdowns all season long. This is just the beginning. I hope you enjoyed the beginning, and I hope that you stick with us for a very fun year here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you're watching this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For 6 months of digital access to post-gazette.com for just $6, click the link down below in the description.